Consumption is booming, but so is inequality.
If the lessons from the global centre's construction seem gloomy, counter that with some time inside it. Here, China's commercial promise is almost palpable. From the main entrance, visitors walk into a cavernous atrium which mixes high-end touches with a fairground atmosphere. The glossy marble floor is flanked by long gold-trimmed escalators. To the left is one large mall, to the right another. Straight ahead is the water park, under the glare of an ultra-long LED screen projecting seaside scenes. The park's main attraction is a wave pool, which generates huge artificial swells. On a summer's day, it is raucous. Hundreds of bathers are in the surf, many with mobile phones in plastic pouches hung around their necks. Pulsating music is blasted at top volume as dancers in bikinis take to elevated platforms. One father, Zhang Meng, sits in the waterside food court, his belly spilling over his trunks as his 4-year-old son licks chocolate sauce off a dessert plate. An ad salesman for a media company, Mr. Zhang has money to spend but is far from rich. When the water park started selling annual passes at just 700 yuan, that's $104, for an adult, he jumped at the offer. Twice a month in the summer, he brings his wife and son. They stroll around the mall, go for a swim, and dine on spicy dumplings. We love the environment, he says. Squint a little, and it could be Coney Island or Blackpool in the 1950s, albeit with digital touches under a vaulted glass roof. This scene underscores the long-awaited emergence of Chinese consumerism. China's economy is often described as unbalanced. Investment accounts for nearly half of GDP, more than double the level of developed economies. Consumption, meanwhile, accounts for about a third of GDP, half the level of developed economies. Yet a simple emphasis on these two ratios misses something important, argues Arthur Kroeber, founder of Dragonomics, a China-focused research firm. Consumption has a low share of GDP in China, not because people are staying away from shops, but because its investment has been unusually large. Looked at from a different vantage, consumption is already booming in China. Between 1990 and 2017, consumer spending per person rose nearly eightfold in inflation-adjusted terms, more than double the increase in India. China is the world's biggest market for passenger cars, smartphones, luxury goods, and beer. This is not a country of repressed shoppers. The pressing concern is, therefore, not whether China can rebalance towards consumption, but whether its spending boom can be sustained. In recent months, much ink has been spilled over the idea that China might be cutting back on consumption. Evidence is patchy at best. Car sales fell sharply in 2018, but that was partly because a tax benefit was eliminated. Retail sales, more broadly defined, remain strong. Obviously, Chinese consumers cannot defy the laws of gravity. If the economy were to slump into a recession, household spending power would inevitably suffer. Yet there is also reason to think that, short of that, consumption in China will be resilient. Big trends work in its favour. Over the past few years, the labour force has started shrinking, which has pushed up wages. Low-end factories are moving abroad. For consumption, this is an unalloyed positive. When workers earn more, they can also spend more. Household consumption bottomed out with a 36% share of GDP in 2010, when construction of the global centre was in full swing. This year, it is on track to reach 40%. Income levels have reached about $5,000 per person in cities, a level at which discretionary spending has taken off in other countries. The fact that the global centre was built in Chengdu, far inland, illustrates the strength of this trend. It is poorer than the coast, but big hubs of prosperity have nevertheless emerged. Chengdu's economy has quadrupled over the past decade. Estimates of the size of China's middle class vary from 100 million to 600 million, depending on how it is measured. Precise estimates are beside the point. What matters is the direction of travel. Consumer numbers are destined only to grow. Even in an age of e-commerce, people flock to malls like the global centre. Along with the usual array of clothing stores and jewellery shops, there are toddlers' play centres, virtual reality arcades, and cosplay cafes. On weekday evenings, people queue outside restaurants on the top floor. But there is a darker side to China's rise as a consumer society. It's yawning inequality. Most countries that undergo rapid growth experience rising wealth gaps. In China, this natural tendency has been exacerbated by the state's control over where people can live. The government gifted urban residents their homes in the late 1990s when property was privatised. Those in rural areas had no such luck. Moreover, the hukou residency system makes it difficult for rural citizens to settle in cities. They are barred from certain jobs and their children are sidelined in the schooling system. When the post-Mao era began, Chinese were poor but equal. The income gap rose sharply from the 1990s. It is among the world's most unequal countries today, with the richest 1% holding 1/3 of all household assets. China has more billionaires than America, even though its income per head is just 1/5. For those on the bottom rungs of the Chinese income ladder, climbing up it has long been a motivation, but it is getting harder. Yang Fanji and her family run a restaurant on a dusty street near the global centre. They deliver about 80 takeaway meals every day to its office workers. Ms. Yang, not her real name, used to work at an electronics factory on the coast for better pay, but returned to Chengdu, just 4 hours from her home village so that her 8-year-old son could live with her. She was able to get him into a local school by pulling some strings, but with a low wage and high living costs, she is unable to save much, making her part of a large and seemingly permanent urban underclass. In fact, there is much China could do for those like Ms. Yang, if it truly wanted to reduce inequality. For a start, it could make it easier for those born in rural areas to move to cities. It has, over the past decade, built up a social security system that gives almost all citizens health insurance and old-age pensions. But payments are meagre. As ageing accelerates, the burden will only increase. Tax reforms would also help. The government does not tax the investment earnings and property of the rich, which are basic revenue sources in developed economies. Officials seem more fearful of angering rich urbanites than of neglecting poor farmers. In a provocative article in 2017, Barry Norton, an economist at the University of California, San Diego, asked whether China was a socialist country. In some respects, he ventured, it was. The government can exercise much more control than is normal in a capitalist system. But on the key question of what it does with that power, he concluded that China was decidedly non-socialist. Redistribution policies have been conspicuous failures. The number of shoppers splashing in the global centre's water park or splurging in its restaurants will continue to rise. But the other part of the population, those on the outside looking in, scrubbing dishes late into the night after a long day serving its workers, also looks firmly entrenched. It is not a happy picture.
Number 3. Means of production. The market is under increasing pressure from the state.
Crowds start arriving at the global centre before 9 in the morning every weekday, well before the shops open. They are the 30,000 people who work in the offices on its upper floors. These contain a motley mix of companies, 1,800 in all, a rough cross-section of China's business world. Some, like Huo Dongjia, would be at home in Silicon Valley. Its main product is an app for conference listings. Wang Qin, its founder, clad in skateboarder shoes and shorts, is refreshingly frank about the headaches of tech entrepreneurs in China. There's too much short-termism, he says. The mentality for investors is if I give you 10 yuan today, you've got to give me 11 back tomorrow. Other offices are starkly different. At the Chuangxing law firm, Fu Xiaojie talks of China's progress in developing the rule of law, but he believes the law answers to the Communist Party, not the other way around. We are making our system more democratic, he says, explaining that this means his firm works with the government to stop disputes reaching courts. His waiting room displays a book with the collected wisdom of Xi Jinping, China's president. China is certainly not a fully free market, yet it has come a long way since Chairman Mao. The structure of the economy looks very different depending on where you focus. There is an exuberant private sector, vital to China's success. Employment in state firms plummeted in the 1990s when the government closed thousands of loss-making companies. The private sector more than made up for them. These days, officials use a rough 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 formula to describe its significance. It accounts for 50% of tax revenues, 60% of GDP, 70% of innovation, 80% of jobs, and 90% of companies. The point is clear. China would be nowhere without its private firms. In many industries, China's entrepreneurs face more cutthroat competition than their Western peers. Take property. The 10 biggest developers account for 30% of sales in America, but around 15% in China. The rush into new industries can be frenzied. China already has more than 1,000 robotics firms. But at the same time, the government seems to be everywhere. China has 150,000 state companies. With preferential access to banks, they account for 70% of corporate debt. And in many industries, from finance to shipping, the government aims for what it calls absolute controlling power, limiting competition and blocking entrance. This is a danger for China when its economic priority is to increase productivity. State firms are much less efficient. Their return on assets is less than half that of their private peers. These two parts of the Chinese business world are often described as separate, as if plucky private firms are battling clumsy state-owned rivals. In reality, they are deeply intertwined. The challenge for private firms is not so much how to compete against state firms as how to coexist with them. Wanjiangli, a water monitoring company with headquarters in the Global Center, has seen its business boom as the government has targeted pollution. In this system, when leaders focus on an issue, it's highly effective, says He Xin, its general manager. But that same power makes for frustrations. To get contracts, his firm must partner with state firms, which have little technology but lots of political clout. The worry is that coexistence, already fragile, is breaking down. Complaints about Guo Jinmintui, the state advances, the private sector retreats, emerged a decade ago when the government gave state firms lots of cash to help the economy through the global crisis. Retreat may at first have been an overstatement, but there is no doubt that the private sector stopped advancing. Its shares of both investment and industrial output leveled off. Now, under Mr. Xi, it looks more like a full retreat. In the 3 years before he became president in 2013, private firms received roughly half of all bank loans. State firms got just a third. In the 3 following years, more than 70% flowed to state firms, according to Nicholas Lardy of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The tone has also changed. The Communist Party has insisted that private companies, including foreign multinationals, establish party cells. A foreign manager at a car parts company, which cut staff last year, says he had to discuss social stability concerns with his firm's party secretary. It was a warning shot. Some observers had thought Mr. Xi would take China in the opposite direction. He initially pledged that market forces would play a decisive role in the economy. But he also vowed to strengthen state-owned firms. The latter pledge has been more potent. Over the past 5 years, the government has merged steel mills, chemical companies, and rolling stock manufacturers, hoping to make them mightier. It has prodded private companies to invest in state firms to make them more efficient. China Unicom, a state-owned telecoms giant, now counts 3 big private internet companies, Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent, as shareholders. This risks dulling the edge of the private sector. Normally, companies get higher returns as they grow and reap economies of scale. In China, the reverse happens, says Mark Williams of Capital Economics, a research firm. His hypothesis is that big companies draw more attention from officials. Political meddling hurts them.